Hey everyone, this is a follow-up video to a video I made a couple of weeks ago called What is an Adventure Game? I got a lot of great responses. I actually was surprised at the outpouring of very insightful and very interesting responses that I got to that video, and so I thought I'd make a follow-up just to kind of come to some conclusions, a few conclusions which I came to and also which some of you came to about what exactly is an adventure game. Before I get started, I probably just want to clarify, why am I doing this? Some of you are probably wondering, why do I bother trying to so carefully or so precisely define an adventure game? You might say, well, who cares? I mean, like, come on, who cares? Is it really that important? Well, the reason why I'm doing this is because people don't know what an adventure game is today. Today, more people play video games than ever before. In the 1980s, it was still kind of, there was kind of a niche crowd of people playing video games. Like, not everybody was playing video games. Today, so many people, like I said, there are more people playing games today than ever before. And yet, uh, if I get to talking to people about games, like if people find out that I like to play games, they naturally ask me, what do you play? And if I say adventure games, most people literally do not know what that is. They understand RPGs, they understand shooters, they understand strategy games, they understand sports games, but they literally do not know what an adventure game is because they've never seen one. And so if I tell them, well, I play adventure games, they'll say, what, you mean like Final Fantasy? No, not like that at all. It's not like Final Fantasy. So our current generation has literally lost the understanding of what an adventure game is. People ask me, what is that? What is an adventure game? And so that's why I'm trying to answer that, because you folks watching my channel probably understand what an adventure game is. You can probably recognize them because you've been playing them. You've seen them on my channel. You've probably seen other people play them. You've probably played them yourself. You know what it is. But there are literally a lot of people today, mostly younger people, like, under 30 crowd, who literally will not understand adventure game if I tell them that I play an adventure game. They'll literally ask, what is an adventure game? So that's why I'm trying to answer the question. Before I get started, one game that I did actually mean to mention in the previous video, but I forgot, was Yume Nikki. Now, I don't know how many of you have seen Yume Nikki. Maybe not a lot of you know it. It's an exploration game, and let's put exploration in huge air quotes, because the point of the game is basically just to walk around a lot. Now, I like Yume Nikki as an art piece. I mean, it has a lot of, it's very atmospheric, and it's known for its very kind of creepy, sort of horror-esque atmosphere. But the problem with it is just that the vast majority of the game is just walking around, just endlessly walking through very long sort of landscapes, finding nothing, and just trying to find like the one sort of hidden thing that's somewhere out there in the big expanse of the game. So that's probably something that you could also categorize as an adventure game, but it suffers from the problem that there's just not much there in its game world. It's an adventure game in the sense that it's about exploration, but if you're going to explore, if a game lets you explore, I think part of the deal should be that it will give you something to find. If you have a space, like a landscape or a room or whatever that you can explore and look through, I think the game's not much fun if there's nothing there to find. Or if there's so little to find that you can spend like an hour just walking around finding nothing before you finally find the thing that you're looking for. I think that's it's not much fun. So is Yume Nikki an adventure game? Yeah, maybe, kind of, sure, probably, yes, but honestly, most of it is just pointlessly walking around finding nothing, and I think that's very representative of a new kind of sort of a new breed of games where again they're called exploration games. Like if you want to give them a genre, they'd probably be called exploration games. That would probably literally be the name of the genre, and they're just about walking around. They're literally just about walking around and finding mostly nothing, taking forever to find something. So just, walking around for a stupidly long time until you find some magic token by chance, just by luck, because you've been wandering around for so long. That's you could argue that's an adventure game, but I think that's a bad adventure game. I think that's not really what I want to cherish or hold up as an example of an adventure game. So a few conclusions from the comments that people left. First of all, it really is mostly about quantity. Now, what I mean by this is, I had asked in the video, what separates an adventure game from, non-adventure games? Is it just like about how much of the gameplay is about adventuring? And I think it really is. Somebody said, yeah, it pretty much is just about quantity. And I guess it makes sense when you think about it. I mean, it seems obvious when you think about it. Just didn't want to jump to that conclusion. But yeah, if you think, going back to what I said before, if you think about a game like Quest for Glory, Quest for Glory has action sequences. It has action fight sequences, but they're a minority of the game. They are only a relatively small part of the game, and so Quest for Glory is generally an adventure game just because, quantity-wise, most of the game is an adventure game. If you had a game where the action sequences took up more time, if you spent more time with the action sequences, that would start becoming less of an adventure game, and then you might say, well, it's kind of like, part of it's an adventure game, partly not. This is another thing that I didn't like about the VGA remake, the VGA fan-made remake they've made of Quest for Glory 2. They tried to emphasize the action sequences more, and that just wasn't something that sat very well with me. I don't want to start going on a big tirade about criticizing that game again, because I've had a lot of bad experiences in the past criticizing that game, and I don't want to criticize it because it is a great game, but it just didn't really suit my personal play style, because it was a lot of it was trying to emphasize more of the kind of achievement winning kind of portions that you can do by emphasizing the action fighting parts of the game, and that's not what I want in an adventure game. The action sequences in Quest for Glory are extremely light. They're very easy. They're very, very, very lightweight sort of action stuff, but that's okay, because if they were harder and if they were more prominent in the game, then it would stop being an adventure game. So the reason why Quest for Glory is an adventure game is just because quantity-wise, the action sequences are not that prominent, and they're very simple. Same thing again with Freddy Farkas. Freddy Farkas had that shooting scene in it, and that was definitely not part of an adventure game. That was nothing like an adventure game, but it was so short. The whole sequence lasts like 2 minutes. So for that reason, Freddy Farkas is still an adventure game. If those sequences lasted longer, if they took up a significant portion of the game's time, then you would say, well, Freddy Farkas is a hybrid. It's it has adventure portions, but it also has action portions. So yeah. How you categorize the game really is just about quantity. If it mixes different styles, if the game mixes different styles, then how you categorize it is really just about quantity. If the game lasts 10 hours and it has like 2 minutes of an action sequence, those 2 minutes don't really count for much. If it's a 10-hour-long adventure game with a 2-minute-long action sequence, you'd still say it's an adventure game, and vice versa. There are action games which have like a 2-minute adventure kind of portion, like a portion which you could consider kind of like an adventure game, and that's the same thing. That's not an adventure game just because it has a very small portion that's kind of adventure-like. It's an action game with a small adventure-ish kind of portion to it. So yeah, in mixed games that mix different types of gameplay elements, it really is just about quantity. All right. So there's that. What else? Somebody said that, I don't know if this is a really key point or like a really defining feature of adventure games, but I'll put it in because I thought this was kind of a good point. An adventure game waits for the player. This is basically saying you can take as long as you want to do the inputs. So I said before that, I don't want to define a game by what it's not. So I don't want to say that an adventure game is not an action game. But I think it's fair to say that an adventure game will generally wait for the player. There's no rush to do things, there's no hurry, it's not based on you doing things as fast as possible. There are exceptions. So ideally, I guess, well, I don't know if this is everybody's ideal, but at least for me, I think you could say ideally, if you leave the game sitting for like 10 hours, like if you go to sleep with the game running, you could wake up and you wouldn't have lost any time in the game because the game's not on a timer. Now, in reality, that's actually not the case. A lot of adventures have used timers. In fact, King's Quest IV is a good example. King's Quest IV actually has an in-game timer. It is a real-time game, so to speak. It's not real. It doesn't really use real time, but it runs in a timer. Like there's an internal timer that runs, and you can actually see the time in the haunted house. If you walk into the haunted house in King's Quest IV, you can actually see the in-game time, and that will show you how much time you have left. So I think the game runs on a 24-hour in-game cycle, and if those 24 hours go by and you haven't, if the 24 hours are up before you win the game, then that's it. You're screwed. You've lost the game. And there are other games that did. I think the first Leisure Suit Larry. The first Leisure Suit Larry game did this as well. It had an internal timer, and it would kill you if the timer ran out before you won the game. So there are adventure games which have timers that you can't just let the game sit for like 10 years and come back to it and expect it to still be waiting for you. But ideally, an adventure game waits for the player. It doesn't require you to do things quickly. The point is just that you can take the game at your own pace. You can take as long as you want, play at your own speed. There's no rush to do anything. The game will wait for the player. So, like I said, there are exceptions. There are adventure games that don't necessarily just wait infinitely long for you, but those games are still about exploration. They're still basic. They're not about getting something done in a hurry. So I'd say that doesn't exclude them or preclude them from being adventure games. So, okay, I'm going to now try to make a concluding statement. I'm going to try to make as broad and as specific a statement of adventure gaming as I can. I want to be relatively broad because, there are many different styles of adventure games. I don't want to be too specific because I don't want to exclude games that might be adventure games, even if they don't quite specifically match the idea that we have of what adventure games should be like. But I also don't want to just throw the net wide open, because something somebody said is adventure game is often used as a catch-all term for games that don't fit into other categories. Often people say, well, it's not this or it's not that. Let's just call it an adventure. And I don't want to. I want to be specific enough to capture what's important to me in an adventure game. But I don't want to get too specific because I don't want to exclude a whole bunch of games which might be good adventure games but are not necessarily, Sierra or LucasArts style adventure games. So let me go ahead and make a very broad but hopefully specific enough statement. Any game which, I'm going to list some points here. Any game which lets you travel around the game world fairly freely. Now, I realize this is kind of open to interpretation. What does fairly freely mean? Basically, if you think back to like the original King's Quest games, they're kind of like the original sandbox games. Like, let's say kind of like a semi-open sandbox kind of game. Because, if you think of like the first King's Quest game, you could go anywhere. You could walk around. Like, you had that whole game map to walk around in, and you didn't really have any restrictions. So it was kind of like that was one of the first big examples of a sandbox game. You could walk around the whole map without too many restrictions. Now I say without too many restrictions because there were some things that were blocked. There was a locked door. There was that stone with the opening that you couldn't fit into. There was that river that you couldn't cross at first. So there are some places that you need to solve puzzles or do some things to get to. That's why I say semi-open. It's not necessarily the case. It doesn't have to be the case that every single location in the game is open to you right up front. But generally speaking, I think an adventure game should give you pretty much freedom to explore the environment, barring places which are locked or somehow otherwise off limits because of puzzles and things like that. I mean, it's fair to have puzzles. It's fair to lock off some parts of the map because you need to solve a puzzle to unlock something. Okay, puzzles unlock things. That makes sense. But a semi-open sandbox is, I think, a good way to put it. It basically means that you can kind of go around most of the environment, and you have free reign to explore around without being restricted by arbitrary restrictions. Because that's really the point of an adventure game, to explore. So to have an environment to explore and be able to explore the environment fairly freely, with the exception of places that are blocked for puzzle reasons, that's, I think, a requirement. That's like one of the foremost requirements of an adventure game. So a game that lets you travel around the game world fairly freely, let's call it a semi-open sandbox. A game that lets you examine objects, because again, examining things is key. I would say examining things is absolutely key to an adventure game. If you have objects in the game and in fact, let's not just say objects. Let's say people, places, and or objects. And not just examine them. I mean, examination, yes, but also and otherwise interact with people, places, and or objects within the game world in a meaningful way. Again, I realize this is super general, but if you think about a game like I don't know, a lot of shooters will have objects in them. Like if you think about something like maybe the original Wolfenstein 3D. The original Wolfenstein 3D sometimes had you in offices. You'd sometimes walk into somebody's office and you'd see there'd be like bookshelves on the wall. There'd be, a desk with drawers in it. But you couldn't open the drawers. You couldn't actually search the desk. You couldn't open the drawers to see what's inside them. You couldn't look through the bookcase to see what books are there. That's kind of what I'm talking about. Those kinds of objects are useless. They're window dressing. They look nice. They have visual appeal, but they're non-interactive. So that's kind of what I'm talking about here. The objects in the game need to be interactive. You need to be able to examine them in such a way that you can get some kind of information about them, some kind of feedback from the game about the objects that you're looking at and otherwise interacting with. And again, not only objects, but also people, things, people, places, and things in the game. So you need to be able to interact with the environment in a meaningful way. More than just shooting at things. I mean, in a shooter, you can shoot at things. I mean, I guess that's interacting with things as well. I mean, technically, you can do this in shooters because you can shoot people, and that's interacting with them in a meaningful way. But let's not be silly here. I'm not just talking about shooting at everything. I'm talking about picking up something, looking at it, getting some kind of information about it, and otherwise using, manipulating, or interacting with objects and people and places in the game world in a meaningful way. And I'll leave that open to interpretation. I mean, what is meaningful? You can develop sort of your own idea of what meaningful means, but I think it's apparent. I hope it's apparent. Just shooting things is not what I mean by a meaningful way. I mean meaningful in the sense that you can get some kind of I don't know if I want to say intellectual, but some kind of sense of these people, places, and things beyond just kill them all and blow everything up. I think this is a very broad statement, a very general statement, but I think it does have meaning. If you think about a game like Deus Ex, now Deus Ex is mostly a shooter. I mean, Deus Ex is not really an adventure game, but something that really made Deus Ex very special to me, one thing that I really like about Deus Ex is that a lot of things are interactive in it. Even just the fact that you can turn on and off the light switches. That's a big deal. The fact that you can just click on the lights in the game and they'll turn on and off. Or, you can click on different objects in the game, and they'll, like if you click on a machine, it might buzz or beep at you or something like that. And those are small things, but that goes a long way. Stuff like that goes a really long way, but towards making the game world feel more interactive. Even just being able to click on things and just have them give a very simple response is a lot more meaningful than most shooters where you just, you can't interact with anything at all. So even little stuff like that, it goes really a long way towards making the game world feel more fully realized and making the game feel more like an adventure game and not just a shooter or an RPG or whatever. Okay. I'm going to qualify that now and say any game which actually provides you with people, places, and or objects to find. This goes back to what I was saying about Yume Nikki. Nice game as an art piece. It works well as an, again, like as a work of art. But you have a lot of games like that where there's just not much out there. And I think this is becoming, I feel like this is becoming very common now because you have a lot of games like, I don't know. Holot is another example. Holot is kind of like a horror game based on a real life incident, and the actual real life incident that it's based on is very interesting. And I thought it would be a really interesting game to, really interesting idea to make a game based on that story. But the game itself is so stupid and so boring. There's nothing there. You're just constantly walking around finding nothing. There's nothing there. You're just walking around, just going over these endless, fields and hills and mountains. And I mean, it looks nice, as a wilderness simulator or something. It looks nice, but there's no point to it. Like there's no story there. There's nothing going on there. You're just walking around and not finding anything. So I think it is important. To really have an adventure game, it is important that the game actually provides you with stuff to find so that you're not just pointlessly wandering around for hours. And there are so many games that I could cite as a cause of this, actually, or as not as a cause, but as examples of this. One of the earliest examples, I think, and I always hate to say this, I hate criticizing very popular games because I know that people are always going to say, "Oh, but that's such a great game, that's such a classic game, you shouldn't be criticizing it." Well, I'm sorry. If there's something I don't like about a game, I'm gonna say what I don't like. So one game that I often think about in this context is Star Control 2. Now, Star Control 2 is a great game, and everybody's going to defend it and say it's such a great game, it's such a masterpiece. It is a nice game. It has a lot of things going for it, but the thing that really bothers me about Star Control 2 is it's an empty world. They advertised the game. The game was advertised as having a huge, such a huge universe with thousands of planets. You can actually fly to those planets in your spaceship and visit all of them. But the catch is, yeah, you can go to all those planets, but there's nothing there. If you've played Star Control 2 and actually tried to explore, go to different solar systems and fly into them and then land on the different planets there, you'll find out, yeah, it's true, the game has thousands of planets, but there's nothing on any of them. There's nothing there. So why would you go there? Why would you go to the trouble of flying to a planet, taking 10 minutes or more to fly to some distant corner of the galaxy and land on a planet there and find that there's nothing there? There are no characters there. There are no structures there. There are no objects there that you can use. At best, you might find some raw minerals that you can mine, and that's it. And actually, that reminds me, No Man's Sky is very much this generation's Star Control 2 because it does exactly the same thing. No Man's Sky, of course, advertised itself as having this endless universe with how many billions of planets located in it. And it was all true, of course. Yeah, it has billions of planets in it, but what is the point of going to them when there's nothing there? You land on all these planets and there's nothing there to harvest. There's nothing to do on them except harvest raw materials. You can dig and harvest minerals or raw materials out of the ground. Okay, great, but there's nothing else there. There's nothing. Maybe there are some creatures, but those creatures are just randomized. They're just randomized things which you could find on any planet. They just, their appearance is subtly different. They have randomized appearances, so they look a little bit different visually. But so what? Who cares? You can't do anything with them. So I really think that Star Control 2 and No Man's Sky are brothers. Like they're really very, very similar games, actually. Just people love Star Control 2 to death because, I mean, it has a nice story. If you know where to go, like if you figure out which planets to go to, it has a nice story. And the dialogue portions, it has some dialogue portions which are kind of adventure-like. I mean, they work kind of like a dialogue in an adventure game, and so those parts are kind of like adventure games. But the rest of Star Control 2, it's so empty. It's so big and so vast, but so empty. There's nothing to find there. So, which again comes back to this point here. The game needs to provide you with people, places, and or objects to find, so that you're not just pointlessly wandering around for hours. Star Control 2. No Man's Sky problem. Again, I know people are going to say, oh, but Star Control 2 is such a great game. It has such a great story. Yeah, it does. But it's not fun to play. At least for me it wasn't. I never had fun playing it because every time I tried to explore it, every time I tried to go out and fly somewhere, there was nothing there. That was for me a huge disappointment. I'm sorry. It's the truth. Okay, and then the last point is what I was saying before. So, the game which focuses mostly on doing the things above and does not much interrupt the above activities with other styles of gameplay. Now, this is what I was saying before. I didn't want to go down the route of definition by negation, which, again, definition by negation means if somebody says, what is an adventure game? You might say, well, it's not a shooter. It's a game that doesn't emphasize shooting. That's definition by negation. You're defining the game by what it is not. And I didn't want to do that because it doesn't really answer the question. If somebody says, well, what's the game like? And you say, well, it's not like this. That tells you what the game is not, but it doesn't tell you what the game is like. So I wanted to avoid definition by negation, but somebody made the point that, you should probably just say the game focuses on doing this, and it doesn't veer down other paths, doesn't start doing other things, because there are a lot of games which will kind of do stuff like this, like, the points that I've typed here, but then they will start going down other paths and doing other things. Again, I mentioned in the previous video, Mean Streets is an example. Mean Streets has sections where, you're examining around and doing stuff and doing typical adventure stuff, but then it will just suddenly put you back in that stupid flying car, and you have to fly the flying car for like 10 minutes to get to the next place, and that it interrupts the adventure portions of the game to have a different sequence where you're doing something totally different that has nothing to do with an adventure game. So that's why Mean Streets is not really an adventure game, because it has so much of flying that flying car. It has so much of the flying portion, the part that you have to do to get from one place to another, that figures so prominently in the gameplay that it kind of stops it from being an adventure game. So a real adventure game does these things here, and it doesn't do other stuff. It doesn't break up the gameplay to go into action sequences, fight sequences, flying sequences, sports sequences, whatever other kind of things, games do. It doesn't focus too much on other stuff. Again, coming back to the idea that it is mostly quantity. So yeah, if the game does other stuff a little bit, okay, a little bit of variety, a little bit of spice, a little bit of seasoning. It's kind of like, when you have food and you want to put some kind of spice or something on your food, you put a little bit of spice on your food, and that gives it a little bit of flavor. It kind of gives it a little bit of something else, something extra. But if you dump like tons of spice on your food, then that's it. You destroy the food because it's no longer about eating the food now. It's about eating the spice. So, a little bit of something else, small action sequences. I always welcomed small action sequences in adventure games because they were a little bit of variety. But if they became too obtrusive, if they become too much a focus of the game, then it stops being an adventure game and it starts becoming some other type of game, whatever those, non-adventure sequences are. So, any game which does these things is an adventure game. There you go. That's my conclusion. That's what I would say is an adventure game. I probably missed something. I mean, I'm sure I might have missed some points here. Maybe some of these points might be controversial. People might disagree with me. If you disagree, please feel free to do so. You can put your comments in the comments. But this is basically how I would, from where I stand now, define an adventure game. And you'll notice that, or you might notice, I didn't focus too much on actual gameplay mechanics. Somebody said that adventure games tend to focus on commands. So you have commands like look at, pick up, talk to. Yeah, it's true that a lot of adventure games do focus on that, but I don't think that that's a requirement. I don't think that's necessarily the essence of an adventure game. That's more just a typical mechanic which a lot of adventure games employ. But I don't think you have to have that necessarily to have an adventure game. And I just want to take a moment on that note to talk about a couple of kind of new school representations of the adventure genre. Because somebody mentioned in the previous video, somebody mentioned L.A. Noire. Now, L.A. Noire it's a nice game. I like that game. It definitely, I think, is a very creative game in that it does something kind of new. It has its own unique play style. It's a very unique game. I feel like there's not really anything quite like it anywhere. I think that there's nothing really quite like L.A. Noire. I think they did a great job with it. And the question is it an adventure game? I remember when it came out, a lot of people were saying it's kind of like an adventure game for the 21st century. It's kind of like an adventure game for people who didn't grow up playing Sierra or LucasArts adventures. And I kind of agree with that. It's definitely not an adventure game in the sense of King's Quest, Monkey Island, those types of games, but it does basically the things that adventure game does. It gives you an environment. It lets you explore that environment and examine it and, find clues and stuff in that environment. And, then you have those portions where where you have conversations with people and there's like a whole conversation tree and you have to pick the right options in the conversation to advance the story. It definitely has all the things that go into an adventure game. It just doesn't use the same sort of gameplay mechanics that classic adventure games used. So, is L.A. Noire an adventure game? Yeah, I think it is. It actually is a good example, I think, of a newer style of adventure game, which, will not necessarily appeal to the purists. It won't appeal to people who are just looking for something that's a Sierra-style adventure. But I acknowledge that it does the things that adventure games do. It gives you an environment to explore. It actually gives you things to, pick up and examine and find stuff out about. In fact, it's actually, in that sense, it's a very good adventure game because it really emphasizes that. It really emphasizes very closely examining things. I mean, if you haven't played L.A. Noire, if you don't know what it is, it's basically a murder mystery, or it's a series of, well, not only murder mysteries, there are other types of mysteries as well. You play a police detective. You play a police detective, and the whole game, well, not the whole game, but a big part of the game, revolves around examining crime scenes. And when you're doing that you really have to pick up everything. Like, you scour the ground and pick up anything that's lying on the ground, and you don't just pick it up and put it in your inventory. You turn it over, you kind of spin it around and look at it, trying to see if you can find any markings on it or any text or any, clues, any kind of indication of what was done with it. You really examine this stuff very closely in that game because you're looking for clues. So it really encourages you and requires you actually to examine the environments and take a very close look at the things that you find in those environments. So I have to admit it definitely, even though it's not what I would think of as an adventure game, because when I think of adventure games, of course, I think of, old school games, but it really does do the things that adventure games do. So I think it's a great example of a new direction that adventure games have kind of taken in the past couple of decades. And just one other game I want to mention is Firewatch. Now, Firewatch is another example of a good game for people to play if you want to see something if you want to kind of see what's happened with adventure games in the past 20, 30 years. Firewatch is definitely not a classic adventure game either. And some people don't like the story. Some people say the story is kind of hokey. Some people don't like the voice acting. They say the voice acting is sort of kitschy. Maybe it is. Okay, I'm not saying I'm not saying it's the best game ever made, but it's a good example of what people have done with adventure games, because it is basically an adventure game. But it's an adventure game kind of without puzzles. It has most of the things that go into adventure games. It has, a big environment to explore. It has, things you can find and interact with. It's just kind of lacking puzzles. It does lack real, for the most part, it lacks like adventure style puzzles, which might turn some people off. But I think it's a good example of what's kind of been happening with adventure games over the past couple decades. Again, is sort of indicative of a new direction that they've taken. So if you folks have not played either of those games, LA Noire and Firewatch, and if you're interested in adventure games and kind of interested in seeing where the genre has gone since the time of Sierra and LucasArts, I would recommend both of those games. I'm not saying they're great games necessarily, but they are at least good games, I would say, good enough to be worth your time. And I think they kind of encapsulate the essence of what an adventure game is about without using an interface or a look and feel that is familiar to us as an adventure game. It's not what you would think of when you think of an adventure game. I think they still satisfy the criteria of being adventure games. So is the adventure game genre alive and well? Well, yes and no. People are still making games that do these things. People still make games that do this kind of stuff. They just have different interfaces. And, most games are still either RPGs or shooters. Most games are dumb. I don't have much interest in most new games today, but I do recognize good games when I see them, or I try to recognize good games when I see them. I try to acknowledge good games when I see them, and that's why I acknowledge LA Noire and Firewatch, because I think that they are good games. I think that people did a good job with those games. I think that the makers of those games did a good job of making an adventure-like game that goes in a new direction, and I think they deserve recognition for that. So, a lot of people know me as a purist. A lot of people know me as somebody who insists that a game has to have a parser, a game has to have, EGA graphics, or it's not a real game. There is that aspect to myself. I do definitely appreciate games that have those old sorts of conventions. But at the same time, I realize that games are art. There needs to be room for creativity. There needs to be room for new forms of expression. And I'm not totally opposed to new games if they're good. And again, I think the games that I mentioned are good games. They're good enough to be worth taking a look if you're interested. So I want to acknowledge talent and achievement in games where it exists. So and there are good new games coming out, just not very many. I think most new games are crap, but there are good new games coming out occasionally, maybe like once every few years now. It used to be that there would be good games, like there would be several good games every year. Now maybe every 5 years there's a good game that comes out. So that's just my prejudice. Maybe I'm prejudiced, maybe I'm just biased. Obviously I am. Every human being has their own bias, so I have my bias just like every human being does, but that's just my opinion, and you can take it or leave it for what it's worth. So anyway, that's all. I'm going to shut up now. Thanks for watching, everyone. Thank you so much for all your feedback and for your ideas. I think that pretty much concludes what to me is an adventure game. I've defined as much as I can what is an adventure game. And that's what I set out to do. So that's it. I'm done. So thanks for watching, everyone. I will talk to you folks later. Ta-ta for now.